Good morning and welcome to our witnesses who are here this morning to speak with us about a number of issues around the agenda of GB Energy and its transition. We're very interested to hear what you all have to say this morning. So could I just, in opening, ask you to introduce yourselves briefly and how your organisations seek to support the UK and Scotland's progress towards net zero. Thank you. You want to just begin, Emma?
Oh, yeah. Good morning, I'm Emma Pinchbeck. I'm the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, which I began in November of last year. The Climate Change Committee's remit in reference to Scotland is to support the Scottish Government with advice on its climate change targets. We'll be publishing the first our advice on the fourth carbon budget for Scotland on the 21st of May this year. And then we also offer progress reports or ad hoc advice to the Scottish Parliament and Government on progress. We also obviously produce the UK-wide carbon budgets and offer advice on progress on those. Thank you.
And hi everyone, I'm Owen Bellamy, so I'm head of the energy team in the Secretariat and the CCC.
I'm Ameena Camps, I'm a Just Transition Commissioner, and I'm also in my day jobs, a manager of Use Wind, and I'm also a trustee of Community Energy Scotland. Just as a bit of an introduction to the Just Transition Commission, so the Just Transition Commission provides independent scrutiny and advice on ongoing development of Scottish Government's Just Transition work, including the Just Transition plans, and carries out engagement with people impacted by the transition to net zero. We also take an holistic approach across sectors and places, and to note that for the Scottish Government, a just transition is both the outcome, which is a fairer, greener future for all, and the process that must be taken in partnership with those impacted by the transition to net zero.
Thank you.
Well done. I'm Richard Hardy. I'm a Just Transition Commissioner like Ameena. I've been on both iterations of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, and I don't intend to repeat what Ameena has just said about what our work does. In my day job, I'm the Senior Officer for the Trade Union Prospect in Scotland and Ireland.
Thank you all very much. My first question would be to Emma and to Owen. Can I ask you, how would the Climate Change Committee rate the ambition and feasibility of the UK and Scottish Government's plans for clean power in Scotland?
I'll start, and then Owen, who has definitely been in post longer than I have, can add anything that I miss. So the nature of particularly energy policy is, of course, some matters are reserved and some things like planning, which is important for building energy infrastructure, are for the Scottish Government, and therefore, just to state the obvious, you do need to have very good joint working between both governments. And I think in general also because Scotland reports on the NDC as part of the UK, because so much of what's important to the Scottish economy is also important to the UK economy on climate change. You do need coherence in what goes on in the Scottish carbon budgets as well as in the UK carbon budgets. Worth noting that the way we do the methodology at the Climate Change Committee is we run the numbers for the whole of the UK economy, and then we run the devolved government reports thereafter, which is why we'll be reporting on the whole of the UK economy to government at the end of February and then doing Scotland in May. So for us as a committee, the UK and Scottish governments really do need to work clearly together. There needs to be clear agreement about roles and responsibilities, better coordination of actions, particularly on reserve matters. Policy related to electricity supply is reserved to the UK government, but substantially influenced, as I said, by devolved policies on planning and consenting, so offshore sites for new renewables generation. Clearly also important for oil and gas, because of where the industry is located. Some of this is beyond the committee's remit in that we publish the pathways on decarbonisation, but the policies are for governments in delivery. But we have said the Scottish Government needs to work with institutions in the UK Government overall, but also the energy regulator, which works right across GB, national and local governments, and now increasingly regional energy strategic planners, so the new energy system operator, which will be putting together this plan for the grid infrastructure for the whole of the UK and GB market. then the Electricity Network Commissioner's report, which was produced by Nick Windsor for, again, the whole of the UK grid, also noted that because planning is important both for grid infrastructure and for power plant and energy infrastructure, that planning process is outdated right across the UK, and both Scottish and UK governments need to take a bit of a holistic review about how that works. So that's as much as we've got, apart from a ringing endorsement that both governments do need to work together to deliver on their climate change targets. Owen, have I missed anything specific?
I guess the main thing I'd add is that it's the Scottish and the rest of the UK electricity systems, the rest of GB systems are quite joined up, so it is really important to work together, because the Scottish electricity system is not a completely separate electricity system to the rest of the GB market. It's very interlinked, and actually in Scotland more electricity is generated than is consumed, so actually a lot of the electricity is exported south to where the demand is. So yeah, as Emma says, working together, because those systems are too interlinked, is really important.
Just to follow up on that, do you have the impression or the view that they're doing the right joint working on those important areas?
I mean, fortunately, I've only been in post since November, which gives me the excellent get-out clause to say it's too early for me to tell you. As the Climate Change Committee, we've got a very good Scottish champion in Professor Keith Bell, who does a lot of work in Scotland. I've been to Scotland once already to see the Scottish Government, and I'll be coming back again before May. And so far as I can tell in government, I think, the decision to locate GB Energy in Aberdeen means that I think that the relationship looks good, or at least there's an understanding in Westminster that we need to work with Scotland to deliver some of the key things in the government's policy agenda, but also on climate change targets more broadly. But other than that, I have only been in post since November, so it's a bit too early to tell you. And I'll save Owen from answering that question.
That's fine, I understand. I would address this question to all of you. The UK government is expected to launch a consultation on new North Sea oil and gas licences in the near future. What outcome would you like to see from that? I'll maybe start with Richard, as Emma started the last one.
I think what I'd like to do is maybe pass that down the table. Our job as a commission is to advise the Scottish Government. It's a UK government decision on those licences. What we were set up to do was to advise the Scottish Government on the way forward in relation to workers and their communities, and the way that we would want to see Just Transition taken forward. So I think that's a bit of a political question for us as a Just Transition Commission. I'm getting the nod from Ameena too. So sorry guys, that's coming your way.
Okay, pass back then to Owen and Emma.
I think there are two parts to that question, not to preempt something you might ask us in a moment about, our own trajectories for oil and gas. So one is, what is the trajectory for oil and gas in the CCC's pathways, or in the North Sea Transition Authority's pathways? So what's the future of the basin in that context? And I might allow Owen to answer that one. But there's the where are we trying to get to and how do you do the transition well piece. And to talk to that a bit, in our view as the committee, for net zero overall, the economy in terms of GDP and growth is better under a net zero trajectory than an economy that is still dependent on fossil fuels. That's for a couple of reasons. One, the energy transition is gathering pace globally, so electrification technologies in particular and renewables are looking set to be a very dominant fuel in the future energy system, with the industrial and economic benefits that come with that. They're also more efficient, so using electricity in that way across the economy reduces our dependence on imports, which in turn reduces the risks from fossil spikes in the future. So there are a number of economic benefits from the transition for the macroeconomy overall. However, we're talking about particular industries also changing significantly in the carbon budgets, and one of those is oil and gas. We draw that out specifically in the Vice, and again, some of this is beyond the committee's remit, but we think there should be much more thought about how we support workers with moving over into renewable industries. I think a report from the NSTA and from the Just Transition Commission said something like 90% of oil and gas workers could work in the renewable sector or in clean technologies. Clearly making that straightforward, actually talking to workers about how they want to do that, identifying opportunities is really important. And the committee has been up with the Just Transition Commission to talk to workers in Aberdeen. So there are a number of, it's very clear to us that the government could do more in that regard. There are also what to do about communities and workforces where it's not possible to transition, and a plan for how you invest in those communities and what you do so that we don't repeat essentially what happened with coal in the 80s is important. I suppose to just give you a highlight, there are opportunities in Scotland, and I've got a couple for you. Sumitomo has confirmed a new £350 million cable factory in the Scottish Highlands. There's been the creation of more than 17,000 new jobs from SSEN, which is one of the transmission and network companies in Scotland, and 1,000 new homes to do this build-out. I think there's a question about how you make sure energy policy is also considering industrial policy. And again, whilst that's beyond the committee's remit, that is something that we've said in order to capture those benefits. And lastly, we're talking about the power sector in this hearing and the role of things like GB Energy, but we'd note that a lot of the change and opportunity in the carbon budgets over the next decade is coming from what we call the demand side in energy, but it's essentially buildings, heating, other areas of the economy where we're electrifying, so jobs for things like heating installers and so on. And you have to consider the energy transition and around rather than narrowly focusing on one bit of the system. And did you want to say anything about where we see oil and gas going?
Yeah, I was going to say there's probably two parts to the oil and gas story in the future. There's the consumption of fossil fuels and the production of fossil fuels. And in the pathways that we've made, the consumption of fossil fuels falls very significantly by 2050. So in our sixth carbon budget, which came out a few years ago, under our pathways, the consumption of fossil fuels falls by about 90%, nearly 90% by 2050 compared to current levels. And that's really the best way to reduce exposure to the volatility of kind of fossil fuel prices, is to reduce consumption. So you're no longer dependent on those. The other part is the production side of things, and the North Sea is a mature basin. The production in the North Sea has already fallen very significantly compared to the peak, which was in about the year 2000. And if you look at the projections that the North Sea Transition Authority make for how oil and gas production could change in the future, because it's a mature basin, even if you expand the production in some fields, that is not enough to compensate for the fact that the overall resource is falling. So in the NSTA's pathways, production of fossil fuels also falls by about 90% by 2050. So overall, there's a story of if we're tackling climate change, consumption of fossil fuels has to fall. But even if we weren't doing that, production of fossil fuels would be falling very significantly anyway in the long term.
So I'm trying to think, though, I think I could guess, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, what you think that should then mean for the consultation on the licences. Should there be any? Should there not be any, I suppose, is the question. Should there be a restriction on them? What should happen?
I mean, I'll take this because I did a select committee last week where I annoyed a previous group of parliamentarians with this answer, which is the 7th carbon budget advice is coming at the end of February. We've got previous positions as the committee out there on oil and gas licensing, but we are in the middle of updating our advice to government. It's sufficiently close to us announcing that advice that I can both tell you some of our advice is changing, but I also can't tell you which advice and what's exactly in it because we haven't advised government yet, and under the Act we have to advise government before we can then inform Parliament and everyone else. After that, I'd be very happy to come back and give evidence on kind of specific committee views, but all I can do now is point you to what has previously been said under the 6th carbon budget. But just note, we are in the we're about to advise government again.
Okay, well, we'll look out for that with interest.
Can I ask?
Yes.
Intervene on this? Yes. Sorry. Emma, when you spoke about the move to renewables, basically stopping us being so vulnerable to spikes in fossil fuel prices, for example, gas.
Yeah.
Yet, due to coupling, that's exactly what is happening. Is basically the price of gas goes up, and the price of renewables, which costs no more to produce, goes up as well. Do you think that should be decoupled?
So this is wholesale market decoupling, which is the idea, if others don't know, that in the UK system, the price of electricity is basically tracks the gas price. A couple of things on that. So firstly, for the committee, we aren't making and haven't previously made very specific recommendations about energy market design. That's because these are policy choices which are really for government. What we have said is because of the overall efficiencies of renewables and their cost to build versus fossil plant, that they are a cheaper technology and the economy overall benefits. We can also see against the baseline that bills will be lower in 2050 if we deliver net zero than they would be if we keep a fossil system. How those costs then flow through the market are choices for government. Under the current market arrangements, what I would say, though, is that even if the market design doesn't change at all, firstly, the presence of renewables on the system avoids imported gas, which overall helps on bills because you're just having to import less for gas generation. There are estimates that the presence of renewables on in the UK market saved consumers a couple of £100 on their energy bills, for example, at the peak of the crisis.
Sorry.
Yes.
We are paying 4 times the price for our energy in the United States, and we're paying twice as much as they are in Europe. But everything that is doing about moving to renewables seems so sensible. I don't understand why this country is being so hampered by these huge energy prices.
We have a very strong... So this is... whilst we're not making specific recommendations on REMA, which is the actual market design, so things like the contract for difference, the capacity market coupling, though that isn't to say we wouldn't look at it if the government asked us to. One of the things we're saying is a blanket recommendation is electricity can and should be cheaper. It's absolutely essential that the government looks at how they can make electricity cheaper for consumers and businesses as soon as possible. As I said, it's absolutely clear that renewables are cheaper than fossil on this end of the system, and we should be able to pass those costs through the system. How the government chooses to do that is sort of reserved for government rather than the Climate Change Committee. But we are very clear in our advice that they should be looking at it. One thing we've said previously that we'll stick to is that for consumers, domestic consumers, if the government chose to not levy the costs of policy costs of electricity bills, the price difference between gas and electricity would be far less and electricity would be cheaper. And that is a relatively straightforward thing to do. I said this at a committee I gave evidence to last week, but there was sort of frustration from our head of Net Zero, Dr. Emily Nurse, and that I think lots of organisations have been making this recommendation to government. The private energy industry where I was working before have made this recommendation to government. Everyone thinks that from an economist's perspective it would be sensible to have your future fuel being as cheap as possible, and the government is less advanced in thinking on this, as was the previous government, than they should be. And so it's our primary recommendation in our progress report to government last year, and one that I'm very happy to repeat here. But how it's done, definitely for parliamentarians and for government to debate.
Okay, thank you. Elaine?
So I suppose this is for the whole panel and kind of on the back of that. So do you think the UK government and Scottish government plans for the Scottish energy sector are aligned at this moment in time?
I mean, I think and I'd be interested in what colleagues think in terms of just transition. Again, we are about to advise on the carbon budgets both for Scotland and for the UK. So there's an element of not being able to tell you fully the detail, but I think it's, as the committee, I think we welcome the opportunity to offer advice on a carbon budget system that has been broadly good for the UK in offering a predictable long-term approach to delivering emissions reduction, whilst also allowing quite a lot of room for policymakers to set out their own delivery pathways, which in these terms means that Scotland can prioritise things like just transition for the oil and gas community, or industrial policy, or things that are perhaps not reserve matters, whilst also working together on things where there is alignment on energy policy. As Owen said earlier, electricity supply is one of those areas where we need to see a lot of alignment, and that's because so much of the natural resource for UK-wide energy market sits in Scotland, or the lovely wind power that is up north of the border. How we move it around the country is important, and so you need alignment in things like planning and consenting. You need those energy markets we just talked about to work for the whole country as well as for each nation. And I think more than ever, you need to see real coordination between the governments of the UK and Scotland to get that done. The UK government's clean energy mission will also require plus because they are setting quite ambitious targets on the build-out of renewables, and some of those projects are in Scotland, as is the grid infrastructure we'll need to deliver the clean power mission. Again, so far as I can tell, having started in November, those conversations are happening, but you should ask me back maybe in 6 months or a year and I'll tell you in real terms what we think. And we'll progress report for both the UK government and Scotland as well, so you'll get more when we do that.
Maybe that brings me to my second question, and it's probably maybe similar. So do you think both governments are working together to prepare for the energy transition?
I think they are, in the context that conversations on things like the UK-wide auctions, the new energy system operators' plans for the clean power mission considered both Scotland and the UK. The advice that we've been asked to prepare is the Climate Change Committee for the Scottish Government considers the UK-wide NDC, the international commitment we make, the nationally determined contribution, but also the UK-wide carbon budget. So in that context, yes, conversations are happening. I think there are, in advice we've issued previously, and to come back to oil and gas, we have specifically said there needs to be more work from the UK government and devolved governments on local impacts and particular communities and particular workforces that will be affected by the transition. Just to be clear, only about 1% of the workforce are in industries that we can't see moving over to net zero industries or new opportunities when you look at the UK overall. But if you're in Aberdeen, that clearly feels different. And I think there is a real need to have better conversations there. And we were grateful to get to go up and speak to Aberdeen workers as part of the work we've been doing on the carbon budget as the committee. And it was clear that those workers need to have much more detailed conversations at local level, at Scotland level, and then, apply that to UK-wide. I think this is also a question where my colleagues down the bench would have a real view.
Thanks, Emma. I think if you look at the approach that devolved governments are taking, so Scotland's had a Just Transition Commission since 2018. The Northern Ireland government is just creating a Just Transition Commission inside the British Isles. The Republic of Ireland government has just created a Just Transition Commission. The lack of a UK-wide approach on this is disappointing, particularly given that a lot of the things that we're talking about today are reserved to the UK government. So there are still issues in terms of progress within Scotland, despite the fact that we've been in our 2 iterations in place for 7 years. I think those conversations are happening at a worker level, a community level, a business level in Scotland, much more so than they are in the rest of the UK. So I think there's definitely lessons that can be learned for the UK government in how it approaches transition. Our view as a commission has long been that this should be something that people feel is being done with them rather than being done to them. And I lived through the coal mining closures of the 1980s and 1990s in Yorkshire, and that felt very much like it was done to us. And it leaves a legacy of hurt, I think, is the best way of looking at that. Just to pick up on Mr MacDonald's last question, the Commission's position on how you pay for decarbonisation is that a flat levy on bills is the least progressive way of doing it and impacts those that can least well pay the most. So we would support a change to the way that that is done.
This is for Ameena and Richard. The Just Transition Commission mainly advises the Scottish Government. What role would you like to see the UK Government play in delivering that transition?
So although our remit is to advise the Scottish Government, we have been engaging with the UK Government. So we send our reports to the UK government, and the co-chairs will be meeting Michael Shanks next month. And as Richard has just alluded to, we would obviously like to see a stronger focus on a just transition at a UK government level. And as has already been mentioned, there's critical independencies between the UK government and Scottish government, particularly in the energy space where very little is actually devolved. So there needs to be a stronger focus on a just transition, both for Scotland and for the UK wide, by UK government. There's certainly signs of improvement in the working relationship between the Scottish government and the UK government, which is the Commission has noted that they're pleased to see. But we've also highlighted there's a need for urgent action at a UK government level. And just as an example of some of the areas that have been noted to UK government that is required and is based upon the engagement we've doing across Scotland, includes like mandating community right to shared ownership, for example, renewable energy developments, grid connection reforms, to both reduce the connection costs for community energy generation, but also reserving a proportion of the grid due to a lack of grid space. And there's already been a conversation on is that market reform that's really needed because of the exacerbated costs in Scotland. Also, in terms of the engagement we've done, so we went to Shetland, for example, and there's some very large-scale renewable energy developments in Scotland, such as Viking. And we spoke to the local communities, and they discussed with us some of the impacts that they're feeling. And it's not just, of course, the wind turbines that are going up; it's the associated infrastructure that's been going across Shetland. And we spoke to some fishermen who have been impacted by them, where they couldn't. It was a scallop fisherman, wasn't it? And he hadn't been able to utilise his grounds for a considerable length of time, to the point where it was on the edge of whether he went bankrupt. And it just shows there's still that disconnect. And this is UK-wide infrastructure. This isn't Scottish infrastructure. This is benefiting the UK. And the community were very clear that they weren't seeing the strong enough beneficial impact for their community. And of course in Shetland as well, they have had for numerous years that benefit from the oil and gas industry as well, so it's even more prevalent where they've had that benefit and now they're switching to the renewable system. So I think it's always important to ground it in real examples as well, where we are out there speaking to people, and it actually became quite emotional. People are really upset about what is happening. So I think it's important for the UK government to also experience some of that so they understand the impacts.
I think as well, as we move towards GB Energy becoming a major player in the energy transition, who is it that's going to be advising Great British Energy on the just transition elements of what their remit is going to involve? If we're talking about Great British Energy becoming a stakeholder or an owner or a developer of projects, how that is going to play out, how are they going to interact with those people who are going to be impacted by those decisions? And what we would like to see is more organisations setting out just transition plans, just transition strategies, just transition targets for what they're seeking to achieve, rather than just this will deliver. It's great that if this delivers lower energy prices, that is a just transition outcome, but it shouldn't be the only just transition outcome, because there will be winners and losers in relation to where the jobs are and the impact on communities. So we would like to see more engagement from those people involved in the sector in relation to their just transition outcomes, and GB Energy seems like a really good place to start.
Thank you. Harriet.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Investment is clearly going to be key for driving this forward, but it's investment and delivery, and those two things have to line up if we're going to make sure that skills and energy security are secured as well. Because as nice as it may be for all our energy to come from clean sources, if people were asked if they want clean energy or if they want the lights to turn on, they're going to choose the lights turning on. So investment is something that we need to make sure is coming through. How is this keeping up with the pace of decline in the oil and gas sector, and how is investment that is or is not open question being lost from the oil and gas sector, impacting the levels of investment that we're seeing into clean energies?
I think so. Just on the capital, so to just give you some global figures, the acceleration in investment into clean technology away from fossil fuel is gathering pace. So in 2015, which was just before I went to work for the energy industry, the ratio of investment in clean power to fossil fuel investments was roughly 2-1. In 2024, and this is International Energy Agency figures, that's now 10-1. In my previous job, and just to declare an interest, I was chief exec of the cross-technology energy trade body before this, and I will tell you from personal experience that by far our biggest problem over the last 5 years from the energy sector was trying to convince investors to invest in the UK as opposed to growing other markets like China, where they've got the biggest offshore wind market in the world, growing markets for batteries, electric vehicles, the technologies of the new energy transition, or India, who have a 500 gigawatt clean generation target for the 2030s. Because of the competition for that infrastructure investment and because of the increased ambition from other countries, you need ambition here. And so I think it's a big concern about how you get private capital into the UK. It's very clear that the global move in the energy sector is away from fossil fuels in general and into clean technology, and it's far outstripping the need in that regard. In terms of keeping the lights on, which is the second part of your question.
In sort of investment's one thing, but investment comes and then there's deliveries afterwards. So there's a gap in the middle where if we are investing into green technology, it's great. But in the meantime, I mean, these projects don't come online quickly. And in the meantime, we risk losing other investment, skills, supply chains, all the things that are actually going to deliver the projects in the end. Where is that sitting in the balance with the decline in the oil and gas sector?
I think the question is, so just on the energy security piece, that we're certainly building projects fast enough to deal with the removal of, say, fossil gas plant from the system. In the Climate Change Committee's remit, our pathways include having to look at economic social factors, which includes obviously running a secure system. The job on security of supply and how you bring power plant off and put new power plant on is really the job of the new National Energy System operator. The margins in the UK are good and they're better than many of our counterparts. I think reliability on the transmission network is world leading. It's like 99.9% or something in terms of security and keeping the lights on. So there's no issue there in the kind of pathway we're outlining. In terms of industrial strategy, which is I think your question about how do you make sure that you keep supply chains, workers and previous investment into those things in this country and move them over into new projects. Some of that is outside the Climate Change Committee's remit, but we have said, and I think I've said in this evidence, and these guys have said that there hasn't been enough thinking about the industrial strategy piece of this over the last 10 years or so of energy policy. And certainly skills and supply chain have become bigger factors in project delivery and pace for the energy sector and other bits of the economy. And by that I mean you need the available workers in order to build things quickly. You need to have the cable manufactured on time to build out your network. There is more competition for those things. And so regardless of climate change, I think from a sensible energy strategy point of view, you need more industrial strategy. The government has plans for an industrial strategy, as well as, I think, the Clean Energy Mission. We would be encouraging them to try and bring those together and make sure, yes, that you can move workers over from oil and gas easily onto new projects. This is a hackneyed anecdote that I always talk about, but it should be possible, for example, to move over marine divers from offshore oil and gas rigs into the renewables industry to dive and do environmental and O&M assessments for the renewables industry straightforwardly. Historically, they'd have been certified by two different bodies. The training would have been different. Those bits of the industry would have been siloed. So I know that the wind industry is doing lots of work to kind of align things like certification standards and training. I think the government as a whole needs to do a lot more work on skills and thinking about moving workers over. And in general, the Climate Change Committee has said, we need to do more on industrial strategy, local impacts, planning for workers, as well as energy policy.
What?
So, this is very much.
This is our bread and butter. So, Emma's absolutely right. The investment is coming in green technology, but what's it buying? And it's not buying jobs in the UK. It's buying things that are made out with the UK and then are brought to the UK, and it's creating some construction jobs. And the lack of an industrial strategy on the part of both of the governments that we deal with is telling. So it's really important that we transition workers and that we skill up workers for the future. But there's no point in skilling up on transitioning workers if there's no jobs for them. And I don't want to steal anybody else's thunder, but unless we start making things, there will not be enough jobs for people to transition into. So Emma's right, very highly skilled, specialised people can transfer between the high carbon sector and the net zero sector. And a colleague of ours on the Commission, Rachel McEwen, was on a SSE podcast yesterday where they were talking about the success that they'd had in doing that, and that's really, really great. But if you go out onto a platform and you look at production workers and you look at the catering staff and you look at the people that are operating that platform, they are not going to be needed to run a wind farm in the Firth of Forth. So where are those people going to transition to if there are no supply chain jobs for us to move into? And that's the key. Investment has to be in investing in production in the UK, rather than we're going to build an X billion pound wind farm and we're going to spend X minus most of it on turbines that are made in Malaysia or in the UAE or in China. And I think that's the real key question. It's not just about the level of investment at a macro level. It's where that investment is being spent and what bang for the buck we're getting as a country from that.
Yeah, I think one thing the Commission has highlighted is as well there's been a lot of public investment in the transition to net zero, but not necessarily the just transition delivery. And when we're talking about, I mentioned earlier that as a Commission we take a holistic view. So when we're talking about just transition delivery, we're not just talking about jobs either. We're talking about housing, we're talking about education for the skills piece, we're talking about social infrastructure, we're talking about health and well-being that all needs to be considered for that fairer future. You know, with the workforce, we're creating a very different type of workforce. We've had conversations with people where you're getting these big build-outs, but then they've got nowhere to stay for that time period they are, and then they will migrate out of that area and move somewhere else. So that creates a very different dynamic for housing, for example. We know there's a housing crisis, and that needs to be connected with the whole public investments piece. It's that strategy which is really key to everything, really, that we're lacking.
Just very quickly on timing, because I think you were asking about kind of timescales underneath all of this, and important because there is a time lag on these projects, and they take a long time to develop and then consent and then build. So the projects, one of the things that's in the NESO's plan that they produced for the government on the Clean Power 2030 mission is to note that all of the projects that they've listed in there are already in the development pipeline and consented, and so a lot of those projects will already have identified things like critical worker need and so on. What you're talking about in terms of where the skills gap is, firstly, on the power sector, it's projects beyond the early 2030s, and that gives us time to think about how to...
If I can just jump in, because I think we'll look at skills later. It's not necessarily skills, it's an important part of it, a very important part of it, and it's a bit that I'm very interested in. But it's the investment, and where's the investment going, and are we putting the investment that's coming into the right place at the same time? For example, you mentioned earlier about energy prices or bills, and fabulous, apparently under cleaner energy they'll come down at some point, but they're not going to come down in the meantime if we're paying out curtailment payments, or if we still have to keep going back to relying on fossil fuels because of the energy mix. So 66% of the energy today is coming from fossil fuels because we don't have the storage, because we don't have
energy, sorry, because that's not the statistic for power
well, the energy mix today.
You mean energy, heat and electricity,
Yes.
rather than just electricity? Because in the electricity sector, it's 40%. Just to,
Okay, well, the energy mix,
which is the big thing for bills. Sorry.
Yes, of course, but I think sort of in terms of how the country works as a whole, I think everything has to be seen very much together, and that actually comes into more of it. I think a lot of the energy policy at the moment is quite disconnected. So there's a lot. I mean, this whole thing together has to be seen as a holistic thing, because as a country, as households, as businesses, as anything, we need to take this as a big approach altogether, and it seems very, very siloed. For example, I understand you've been in since November, but a lot of it's like, that's not on our remit, we haven't come to that yet, and vice versa along the line. It feels like there isn't much joined up insofar as where's this investment coming from, where's it going to, is it being put in the right places?
So the reason we say it's not in our remit, some of these decisions are for government, as in do you want to do more on, for example, price is your priority, getting the price down of projects and using energy policy to drive down project costs and capital infrastructure costs and project development, which flows through to bills in that we currently levy fund those off bills. So if you are building cheaper projects, it's a smaller amount to levy, and that infrastructure then produces cheaper power, which overall then impacts energy bills. That's a policy decision for government, which I would argue has delivered those outcomes. But what that market arrangement didn't focus on so much is, a wider industrial value. For example, do we want to build slightly more expensive projects, but be able to have skilled workers or more supply chain in the UK? And these are policy decisions for government. The Climate Change Committee's job is to advise you on the route map to the roadmap in the macro economy to delivering the net zero target. Government then makes decisions on the relative balance of things like, energy bills, where they're levied from, whether it's done in taxation or on bills, the benefits in the economy, whether you're looking at regional investment or industrial strategy or indeed electricity prices overall. And we're a statutory independent body, but we are unelected. Some of these decisions are very much for you guys. What we can tell you on the macroeconomic point is that bills overall benefit from investing in low carbon technologies, and the macroeconomy looks to benefit too. That's because the electricity that renewables produces is cheap, and we're looking at a more electrified economy which is more efficient. So it's just you just make savings across the economy from a more efficient energy system, as is the case in the economy. Since the word dot, it's a bit like moving from coal to oil and gas. We're moving to electrification.
Thank you. I think I'm responding to Ron. Thank you.
I have to say before we go on, I'm about to take Stephen with a supplementary. We are fast running out of time, so if questions and answers could be a little bit more focused, it'd be very helpful. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for your comments so far. Just a couple of very brief questions in relation to the balanced pathway to net zero. There is obviously still a need for some oil and gas consumption. Do you believe that's an argument in favour or against domestic production? In relation to the decoupling of electricity from the price of gas in relation to energy bills, do you believe that would be a help or a hindrance to the delivery of renewables projects going forward? And just finally, in respect of the communities who perhaps matter most here, and I think for those of us who live in the North East, we live it and breathe it on a daily basis. What they want is certainty. They want certainty that there's going to be jobs. They want certainty that there's going to be opportunities. Do you believe that the current government's plans are adequate in respect of providing that supply chain certainty for key industries like carbon capture and storage and others where we still lack clarity from government as to whether there's going to be investment in projects in the North East of Scotland?
Shall I pick up the last question first?
We're right.
And I'll be as quick as I can. I think the answer is in our annual report from 2024, which is no. Our advice to the Scottish Government is that if you keep doing things the same way that you're doing things, you won't deliver a just transition. So things need to change. Now, we haven't given advice to the UK Government, and I might step outside my role a little bit, but say that we'd probably give the same advice to the UK Government as well. I think all communities matter, Stephen. I think that some have got more investment today in it than others, but high energy prices impact everybody across Scotland, and we have to make sure that we don't deliver a postcode lottery outcome for Scottish communities that are impacted by this. But we've been very clear that just continuing to try and deliver an energy change the way that it's been delivered for the last 25 years will not deliver a just transition, and what we will leave is what we will have is communities that are just reliving the hell of decarbonisation of coal.
You'll forgive me, Richard. I don't necessarily want to disagree with you, but I was talking about carbon capture and storage. I was talking about the likes of offshore wind, where 2 years ago there wasn't even a single bid put in place for the offshore wind leasing round at UK level. So I was more interested in that aspect with regards to the delivery of projects which are going to drive that supply chain in the North East of Scotland.
Looking at LSC, which one do you want to do the decoupling one, and on oil and gas, and that was the kind of conversation again about UK production and oil and gas. Again, I know this is it's vexing for anyone that we're giving committee evidence to at the moment, because we are right before a carbon budget. I can tell you, as Owen did, I can repeat what's in on our pathways, which is we've got oil consumption falling in the 6th carbon budget by 52% for 2035 and 85% by 2050. Our pathways, the range in our pathways is sort of 46 to 62% by 2035 and 84 to 98% by 2050, so almost all the oil coming out of the economy. On gas is highly dependent on the government developing carbon capture and storage technology. In our pathways, as in most pathways that look at the energy transition or decarbonisation, once you consider economic factors and social factors, we think that we need to have some abated gas in the system. That's true. The range for that means that total UK gas consumption, including CCS, falls by 41 to 59% by 2035 and 50 to 91% by 2050. So, as Owen said, we can see a big decline in the need for significantly oil, but also gas in the economy over the next decade and a half. But the basin is already declining, and the NSTA would say that. So I think there's a need to plan for reduced UK production. We'll say from one of the things that came back from the visit that the committee made to talk to workers in Aberdeen, and just to put this on the record, is the workers in Aberdeen did not think that oil and gas was going to decline. And I think there is we would say there's been a failure of communication to those workers about the transition that's coming and what we need to do to help them prepare. And that is a role for government that, the committee is on the record as saying is necessary, with very clear information about the condition of the basin and then the likely change over to clean technology. On licensing, there is an existing position out there that I can point you to. I can't tell you anything more about the advice for the 7th carbon budget or beyond, because we haven't advised government yet.
The decoupling.
And then just on decoupling, I guess that's something the government's looking at as part of the REMA programme they're doing, so review of electricity market arrangements. And it comes back to some of the discussion area as well. One of the key ways they're looking at for kind of doing that is moving more towards contracts for difference, which are a kind of natural way of decoupling the price of renewables from the price of electricity more widely. So I think as you move towards a more renewables-based system and you have more renewables projects that are on contracts for difference, and that will naturally lead in that direction anyway, which would be supportive for low-carbon projects.
Can I just say that there is a big debate going on about markets, but one thing we haven't mentioned is infrastructure build-out, and a colleague mentioned constraint costs in Scotland. You need to build grid and build infrastructure. And one thing about that on the question of investment is market stability can help move that investment in. So government is weighing the need to send clear signals to investors by keeping market stability. I'd argue the carbon budgets can help you with that, by the way. But also the need to reform markets so that consumers most benefit from the technology. It's both not either. At the moment, there is a need for a significant amount of infrastructure build-out, including some of those big cables moving power from Scotland to the UK, and that will, once those are built out, help relieve some of the constraint costs that were mentioned.
I think it's fair to say that not everybody sitting and giving evidence thinks that more CFDs is necessarily the best answer in relation to generating investment and supply chain jobs.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Susan.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about the UK's energy infrastructure and what needs to happen in order to maximise the potential for clean power. A lot of that has been touched on in what you've spoken about in the industrial strategy, and I'm really interested to hear what was said about how we keep the jobs in the regional areas by perhaps looking at different ways of developing these projects. So I suppose I am going to ask you, what do you think needs to happen to maximise this? But also I have a question about what do you think the impact of regional supply might be, and the effect that that would have on the infrastructure that was needed.
So I'll do this relatively quick. Unusually, I'll do this relatively quickly. I'll try and be brief. So I think I almost just covered actually the big things are we need to build a lot of kit. We need to build new power plant in the form of renewables, all kinds of renewables. We need new forms of storage technology, batteries, pumped hydro, the full range. We need grid infrastructure to support that technology and move power around. And then you also need actually digital infrastructure, I'd argue, so that we can manage the system smartly. So understanding where technologies are on the grid, being able to understand energy use in homes. We need technologies in homes to best use that energy from the grid, so electric heat pumps, electric vehicles, and from the carbon budget's point of view, that's actually where we could do with seeing a lot more attention, including the workers that we need to do that transition. And in order to facilitate that building, we need planning reform and consenting reform. We need to be able to work out where we're putting kit as fast as possible to strategically plan it, but then also to get it through the planning and consenting system. We need grid connections to be there to connect it, which means connections reform because the pace is extremely slow at the moment. And we also need the markets that facilitate the investment, the question earlier, into those technologies so that we can finance them in the most efficient way possible for the British public. I think it's that collection of things. Those all exist at the moment in energy policy. There is work going on because of the government's clean power mission to accelerate some of that. It's too early to tell what the effect of that will be, but there's a lot of work going on in that space. The thing I would add, and we've all touched upon it, is that is not the same thing as delivering you regional jobs or assessing local impacts. I think the Scottish Government has consulted on things like community benefits, so is the UK Government. That's welcome. As the Climate Change Committee, we've said you need to do a lot more thinking about local workforces, particularly impacted workforces like oil and gas, and regional benefits. I'll leave the regional question, which I think is about community energy, for
just not the need to move it all the way across the country. So you're
how much can you do locally?
Yes, so you're not generating in the north of Scotland and using it in Kent. I mean, I know it's not as literal as that, but
yeah. Well, so some of it is innately geographic because you get the best efficiencies and the most returns from building your renewable energy plant where you have the most renewable energy resources, and Scotland is very windy, and we're building out at sea. The further we've gone out to sea, for example with offshore wind, the bigger the yields, the cheaper the projects. So there is an advantage in putting things in particular places, which is hard to avoid in these systems. But what you can do, and this is the part about investing in decent digital infrastructure and decent system management as well as physical grid, trying to match demand and supply more accurately. Once people have electric vehicles and heat pumps in their homes, that also becomes something you're doing on the grid as a whole, and that's why we think there are such big savings, because it's just more efficient to use the power that way. You can locate batteries with power plant, all of that kind of thing. And some proposals for market reform look at more local power markets, so the committee does not have a view on that. I think that's... Owen, do you want to add anything on the energy system?
I guess the only thing I'd add is that there are potentially some benefits from having those kind of smaller local projects. For example, where there are kind of constraints on the electricity network, then if you can build some kind of smaller local projects, then you may be able to avoid some of those kind of grid upgrades that are needed. But then on the balance of that, smaller scale projects are typically more expensive than kind of larger big projects, because you can't get the economies of scale that you could otherwise get in a kind of larger project. So there are kind of balances there between both angles, really. Well,
they perhaps could be more expensive, but also the socioeconomic benefits would be greater. So a game changer that we have noted as a commission is the community right of ownership of renewable energy assets, with community-owned projects that greatly enhance community wealth building. They've been doing it for a long period of time now. You're talking about a small percentage of community benefit, or you're talking about 100% of profit going to local communities for that local benefit and local jobs. In terms of local supply, there are limitations in local supply. It's very difficult to do that at the moment, which is why there's calls for a local electricity bill, which I'm sure you've seen, which would enable that local supply and, like you said, be less dependent on the grid. So if I'm in the Western Isles, that's where I'm based. and the community would like to be able to have local supply from the turbines that are in the Western Isles, but it's very restrictive at the moment. So the policy levers and the legislation to do that would be beneficial for those communities. A good example in the Community Energy State of the Sector report in 2022, it said an average of 70% of a community group's expenditure is spent locally. So that shows the massive difference where a lot of the industry-based renewable energy developments are still maintaining that extractive model of taking it out with those communities. And GB Energy has a role to play in this, or could have a role to play in this, in overcoming some of the key barriers to enhancing community energy projects and just rolling those out further across communities in Scotland, including support, so capacity is a big issue, but also access to finance.
So I think if you look at the other countries have taken a very different approach on community energy. So if you look at Denmark, 16% of their wind projects are community owned. Benefit is a benefit, but community ownership is transformational. And you know, our view is very much that community ownership will deliver a just transition, whereas community benefit is more about just ameliorating the edges of the change. And we say that quite strenuously in our latest report.
I think it's important to distinguish ownership from the location of the asset, and that's because the GB system is going to, amongst other things, have, for example, nuclear on it. We've got offshore wind on it, and this is big infrastructure which is located far away from most communities in many places. And so you've got two questions in terms of, I suppose, fairness. One is the cheapest system overall, so that someone in pick an example, in a city tower block where they can't have a solar farm or an onshore wind farm near them, can still benefit from the cheap prices overall of renewables, and also the minimum cost of transforming the system as a whole. And it is true that community projects, because they're smaller and often more bespoke, do cost more. It's about £140 per megawatt hour on average for a small solar project, about £50 per megawatt hour for a large scale. So in the committee's modelling, which is responsible for looking across the whole economy, we have quite a lot of large infrastructure for that reason, which isn't to say that there isn't a role for community. On ownership, that's a slightly different question, and there are, I think, consultations out on community benefits, but just to note, those can also be, there are lots of different models you could use for that, and we wouldn't have a view on it as a committee, but it's certainly worth looking at the question about how you get public support.
But it's important to distinguish between community benefit and community ownership. So it's very, very different. So there's community ownership, where it's grassroots, community-led developments. You've got meaningful shared ownership, where the community has a stake in that project and is fully participating in that project. And then you have community benefits, where it may be projects such as offshore wind, where it's more difficult for a community to develop, and they are paid usually in funds. It could be other benefits, but usually a fund. And the community benefit rate at the moment is only £5,000 per megawatt, and it's voluntary. So that's another thing that the community sector has called for, is a mandatory community benefit, where community ownership may not be possible, and also an increase in that community benefit rate, because it's not proportional, it hasn't increased with the cost of living. And they're calling for a base rate and a ramp rate. So the base would be equivalent to similar to what it is, but higher, something around 7,500 per megawatt, and then a ramp based on generation. So the communities are benefiting from these very windy areas with high availability.
Okay, we're actually out of time, and we have another panel, and we still have a lot of questions we want to ask. So can I ask questioners and the panel to keep to the focus, please? And we will be directing questions to specific people to answer. If we could try and keep to that, it'd be very helpful. Question number 5, Kirstine.
Thank you. And a lot of my questions had already been answered around skills, the need to align with an industrial strategy, and the need to ramp up manufacturing in this country. So I'm going to ask my question around a very live issue, that of Grangemouth. So can I ask you what the lessons for the transition should be for both the UK and Scottish Government, given the situation at Grangemouth refinery with the impending closure?
Are you directing that to...
Sorry, to Ameena and Richard, please.
So obviously we've done a lot of work on Grangemouth. We've worked quite closely with the community, with the workers at the plant. I think it's a shining example of how not to do anything. And that's the key lesson to learn from how we do change in the future is not to do it like it's been done at Grangemouth. I think it's fair to reflect that lots of promises have been made by various people of various in various different roles, none of which seem to have come about. So honesty is a good place to start. There needs to be, in our view, conditionality around the provision of public funds to people, particularly very rich people living in tax havens who own football teams, who take public money and then spend that public money divesting jobs in communities that are very precarious. This is not the first time that community has gone through industrial change. It was obviously at the heart of the coal mining decline as well. What we would want to see is organisations, the Commission's view is that high carbon organisations have to have an exit plan, and they need to bring forward those exit plans so that what we're not doing is making a decision in January and then telling people that their jobs are going to be gone by the end of November. That's what happened at Long Annet, which was a much more controlled process. Scottish Power, I'm not here to speak on behalf of Scottish Power, but they had a long-term plan. And when Long Annet closed, of the 350 people that worked at Long Annet, everybody that wanted to remain economically active remained economically active as a result of that. But that was a 5 to 8 year closure programme. It was accelerated as a result of a technical issue at Long Annet. That's what we say in our report. High carbon industries need to start to come forward with, this is how we're going to exit from this business, or this is how we are going to change our business to be, we're going to engage with carbon capture and storage and whatever. But it is fair to say that Grangemouth, I think I went on Newsnight and said it was a litmus test for just transition, and it didn't do particularly well, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thank you. Angus? Some of yours has already been answered, so...
No. I mean, every word you say, I just adore. I've got one slight bone to pick with you, but I'm getting... Emma, can I come back to you? So that basically the Highlands is generating the electricity for Britain.
Yes.
We have the highest level of, well, to a significant percent. And we have a very high level of fuel poverty up there. We're paying much higher connection fees. None of us can get mains gas, which is a third of the price of getting kerosene or electricity. The energy price is fixed on gas, or the electricity price, rather than the other way around. We're facing the industrialisation of the Highlands, but with only downside at the moment. We talk about the voluntary £5,000. Actually, I think it should be 5% of gross revenue, and I've worked very closely with Highland Council. We're making no way with the Energy Minister on this. It's twice in the GB Energy put forward amendments calling for community benefits to be considered, which have twice been taken out in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. I just don't know if the government are taking it seriously, this community benefits, and whether you think that we can actually make it legislation that community benefits should be a legal requirement at Westminster.
Angus, who's that directed to?
Sorry,
me. Look, I can tell you, so the committee doesn't have an established view on community benefit, and that's because our mandate as the CCC is to look across the macroeconomy. And what we can tell you about that is we know that building out the system, locating infrastructure where it's most efficient, moving it around the country to where there are areas with high demand. The UK-wide energy system overall benefits from this move to renewables and building them in efficient places. And then UK consumers benefit from being able to use cheap electricity in their homes. We can see that in the overall model. What we can't, and we are not mandated to do, is to dial down in what that means for each area of the country, apart from the advice we offer for devolved nations as a whole. What the committee has said, though, is that there is this need to take more seriously local impacts across the piece, and what we are on the record as talking about and have existing advice on is the communities that are particularly impacted by the transition over from energy and high fossil intensive industries into clean energy industries, and in particular we've said something about oil and gas in Aberdeen. We have also said cheap electricity is absolutely necessary, and we are frustrated at the lack of progress on this, and I suppose by extension cheap electricity is low bills for people. At the moment, I think we all acknowledge that we're in a world where we're building a large amount of electricity infrastructure and telling people completely accurately that it is the cheapest form of power, and then people are not experiencing that on their bills. And there is a need to accelerate that. How you do that, this balance between investing in jobs and local industries and manufacturing and cheap market mechanisms overall, the balance between what you want to do in the UK in terms of supply chains or globally, what you do for local communities that are hosting the infrastructure. These are literally outside our mandate as the Climate Change Committee, though government could ask us to look at any of them as ad hoc advice, and we would. I think we acknowledge the issue though, and have said, we've recognised the Scottish Government consultation on community benefits. We've recognised that the UK Government has previously consulted on it, and I think we see the challenge. I suppose the last thing I'd say is this is not a new problem, and this is not a committee view. This is a Emma Pinchbeck view, and I've said it in previous evidence sessions in my last job. When we did the great grid upgrade in the 1960s, there was pushback from communities that felt that they were hosting infrastructure. At that time, it was English constituencies being angry that they were hosting pylons to move energy to the Welsh. And now we have a similar issue where we're building infrastructure in communities that haven't seen it before, and we're moving power around the country. What happened then was a very big communications programme. That we rolled out footage in cinemas, we engaged with communities, we looked at particular benefits, but we also talked to people about why we were doing it. The committee does have a view that government should be doing far more of that, and that's working with impacted communities, but it's also talking to the country as a whole about what we're doing and why we're doing it and why we're building the infrastructure, and we would certainly like to see more of that.
Thank you. Lillian.
Thank you very much. So what could the UK and Scottish governments learn from other countries on how best to manage a transition from fossil fuels to clean power?
This is a nice plug. One of the things I've discovered since taking the job is there's a network of 25 other climate change committees internationally, and other countries who have carbon budget systems or approaches on climate targets which differ slightly from the UK. Some of them, I would say, South Africa, to give an example, Australia, are more thoughtful about climate adaptation and just transition than the UK system is, and it's been a pleasure learning from them about how they advise government in those areas. I would encourage you all to look at the International Climate Change Network and the way that they structure their advice to governments. It's the first thing. In terms of UK progress against Europe, there is a good story to tell in terms of how fast UK emissions reduction has been achieved. I would obviously tell you that's because the carbon budgets are a very good system for decarbonisation. They are not the same as hard targets. They offer a 5-year range, and the independent advice from the committee can then be taken by government and adapted in terms of a delivery plan that works for governments of different colour and inclination. If they're more interested in industrial benefits, more interested in private investment, there is scope in the carbon budget system for a lot of room, and but whilst offering the kind of predictability about general direction of travel, which unlocks private sector investment and helps you deliver and plan your transition efficiently. So whilst Germany and Ireland have followed a similar trajectory to the UK, the Netherlands has been a slower pace of decarbonisation. Other European countries are broadly behind UK progress to date. So that's the good news. Just to refer back to a previous answer I gave, what's changed over the last 5 years is internationally we're facing much more competition from other countries that I would say are going faster. We've yet to see what the new Trump administration means for actually on-the-ground delivery of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, but that moved a lot of private capital over to the US into energy industries over there. We've also got competition from India with their 500 gigawatt target for fossil fuel generating capacity by 2030. Over 130 countries have pledged to triple global renewables capacity by 2030, and that was done at COP28. So there's just this huge move towards the energy transition. And I think the overall message on this is we're in a very good place with our climate governance. Scotland will have our advice on its fourth carbon budget shortly. I think there are lessons to be learned, particularly on industry, on this question of planned transition, on adaptation, and on things from the other climate change committees and other governments. But overall, the world is moving very quickly in this direction, and I think the main message is not to get left behind rather than to be worrying about how far we've been ahead over the previous 10 years. Is that fair, Owen?
That's a good summary.
That's good.
And just to reference, so Richard briefly mentioned Denmark as an example. So their 2008 legislation introduced a requirement for all wind farms to be 20% community owned, so on the topic we were talking about previously. And Ireland has a good example as well of the small scale renewable electricity support scheme package, which included a feed-in premium for community and SME projects, with a higher rate provided to community projects due to the additional barriers to support them, and it was to help meet EU targets for community energy projects. I also referenced the ZCC Act in Shetland, so we actually have some UK good examples as well of what we can achieve, and looking at what additional powers might be required to help maximise those social and economic benefits in the UK and in Scotland.
If I just in conclusion, I think Emma's already raised the point of communication, and I think very much over the last 15 to 20 years, government hasn't seen a role for itself in communicating. It's left change very much to the market. If you look at how the Germany, Belgium, Holland triangle dealt with the decoaling the Ruhr, there was very much more communication. Amina's mentioned Ireland as one positive outcome. I'd also say, Ireland got it wrong when they shut Bord na Móna, having agreed a just transition plan with the unions and with the communities, and then overnight ripped it all up and closed Bord na Móna a week after we'd agreed a just transition plan with them. So there are good things out there to learn from, but equally there are some really bad things to learn from in terms of how not to do stuff. But I think genuine conversation with people, and where possible co-design of an approach to decarbonisation is the way forward. That's what we've been providing evidence and guidance to the Scottish Government on. Co-design is always better than just telling people.
Okay, thank you. And is there a risk of investment in clean power going overseas if the UK and Scottish governments fail to maximise Scotland's potential? Do you think?
Is that on investment, did you say? Sorry, I missed the first bit. I think there's a good story to tell broadly on electricity decarbonisation. So we are about, overall the UK is emissions are about 49.2% down. I always look at the team now to make sure I get this right and don't get beaten when I get back to the office. Just under 50. I hope it's 49.2 and I get the gold star. We're just under 50% down on emissions since 1990 levels. That has made us world leading in terms of emissions reduction, but a lot of that's come from the power sector and the move from coal to renewables rather than through gas, which is how everyone expected the transition to go. A lot of that has come about because of the carbon budget's clear system of governance. That gives confidence to the private sector. I know that because I've come over from the private sector and they like the carbon budget, so you can kind of see a clear trajectory without them being so restrictive the market can't do what it does well in terms of innovation and financing. It's also because our electricity market arrangements up until this point have delivered what they were designed to deliver, which was pushing the costs out of new large-scale infrastructure. The projections for offshore wind were that they would be, the government's projections were that the industry was supposed to get offshore wind down to below £200 per megawatt hour by 2030, and in the latest auction rounds it's sort of £56 per megawatt hour. So that the electricity market arrangements brought in, I think, the best of the private sector with the state to solve that price challenge. What they didn't do, as we've discussed, is kind of broader things like in industrial value, thinking about workers and skills and the rest. So not to say they're perfect, but I think there's a good story to tell there. Where we have not delivered as effectively is on grid infrastructure, on planning and on speed. And you've heard ad infinitum from all of us about plans for workers, plans for skills, and wider economic questions in terms of manufacturing and industry. In Scotland, just without question, there is huge potential for Scotland. You've got wave and wind and tidal resource coming out of your ears north of the border. That's a very good thing. how the Scottish Government chooses to deploy those technologies we'll say more on when we advise government in May from the committee's point of view. But also we would encourage the Scottish Government to be working with the UK Government, the other kind of key energy bodies like Ofgem and the NESO to make sure you do that roll out as efficiently as possible with the best benefits to Scotland as possible. And then there are questions which are, again, outside of the committee's remit on what you do to make sure there is a maximum industrial benefit for Scotland in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's the end of our questions. You'll be delighted to hear. But thank you very much for your contributions this morning. It's been genuinely very, very interesting. I'm sorry if it was a little bit rushed, but I'm afraid we're trying to hear as much as we possibly can. So thank you very much for cooperating with us on that. And we'll no doubt hear from you at some point again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's true. Welsh Railways.
Morning, everyone. If our panels have changed over very quickly, so thank you for that. And welcome to our second panel this morning. We're very much looking forward to hear what you have to say. And I am going to hand over to Harriet Cross.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I'll keep the first question relatively brief, and it's more to do with just the ambition and feasibility of the two government schemes for looking at the transition of the energy sector. And in your answer, if you could maybe refer to the NESO report as well, and just sort of your take on sort of how that plays into and what's that sort of how that sits beside the two plans of the two governments. Anyone can take that up.
I take that first. So I think both the Clean Power Action Plan and the subsequent plans are certainly achievable, ambitious, but definitely achievable. I think Scottish Government's plans and some of the core plans we've been looking for have been delayed for a little bit of time. So the Energy Strategy and Just Transition Plan was meant to be this big sort of unifying document, which has been an ongoing process. So we hope to see that really, really soon. From engagement around that, we did feel that it was ambitious again, but deliverable. I think where the rubber meets the road on this is around the next step, specifically from the NESO plan, which is the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan. So this is, the NESO plan sets out here are the things that we want to do and the key decisions that we need to take. The Spatial Energy Plan then sets out here's where we're going to build everything, or where we think everything needs to go and how we're going to work to deliver those things. That was co-commissioned by UK Government, Scottish Government and Welsh Government. So speaking to your earlier question as well around collaboration, that's quite a positive signal. And just from personal experience being involved in Scottish Government and NESO engagements through the Clean Power Plan process, the vibe has been broadly positive. Definitely achievable, and it seems like there's practical working together. We'll find out for sure. This will all come out in the wash through the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, in our view.
Thank you. So from your point of view, Scotland and UK are quite aligned at the moment. Are there places where they're diverging, or sort of are the two governments, does it seem like we're working together?
They're certainly working together, but I think previous panel pulled out well that this the just transition point in Scotland is a much bigger deal in Scotland and in Wales and in Northern Ireland than it is at UK level just now. I don't think it's miles away. I think the general tone of the conversation around the energy transition has been broadly positive about the need for social and economic value and benefit, the need to make sure that people aren't being unfairly harmed or penalised through that process. What we don't have, as was pulled out previously at the UK level, is a formal panel commission way of embedding that into policy making just now, and we would certainly like to see that be brought through. Not just because we think it's a good or a right thing to do, as I'm sure most of the people around the table would agree on behalf of their constituents, but also there's this crucial point that we can't get to net zero full stop if you don't have everyone with the ability to get to net zero within that process. So we would like to see that branched out as well. Good collaborative working on the nitty-gritty energy system stuff, but more broadly, that's something that we would like to see pulled across.
Thank you. And then just looking at, again, like the feasibility, just in terms of timescales, how, assuming we're looking at the 2030 as the sort of the immediate timescale for decarbonising the grid, and then obviously the 2050 longer stop, how feasible do they feel relative to the current plans?
They still feel feasible. I don't think there's any major concern. Again, a good acknowledgement that Clean Power 2030 in particular is an ambitious plan, and it doesn't necessarily lay out all the details for how to get to where we need to get to for 2030, but a general, I'm not going to say full consensus, but a general agreement that it can be done, and it's absolutely what we should be aiming for. I guess the only slight, not concern in terms of Clean Power 2030, but obviously the Scottish Government, pragmatically, you could argue, rolled back on the previous climate change commitment. I don't think it's necessarily a terrible thing to be able to be pragmatic with that type of process, but it makes that net zero 2045 commitment all the more prescient, and it makes 2030 in the interim an important stepping stone to collaborate on to get there.
Thank you.
Can I add an overlay there, building on what Fraser's comments are? So Paul Leeuw, Robert Gordon's University. So yes, I like the ambition of the NESO plans and everything and the clean power. It's great. But it is about what sits behind it. What's the investment, what's the activity, what's the doability. And I'll give you a very practical example, is on a wind site. So currently there's about 15 gigawatts of offshore wind installed, plus or minus a bit. We want to get to over 50 gigawatts in a very short period of time. That is 35 gigawatts over 5-6 years. 6 gigawatts a year by my calculation. Yeah? So if you have an average kind of wind turbine, which is 15 megawatts, you'd install 400 wind turbines a year, just over one a day. We are not installing a wind turbine a day for the next 5 years. We're not having the plans, the activity to do that stuff. The same for substations, the same for cabling, the same for grid connections. The activity needs to back up the kind of ambition. So the plan is critical, delivery is critical, visibility is critical. That's what we look for. Nothing wrong with the ambition. It's turning ambition into investment, activity and reality. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, just to build on Paul's point. So Hannah Corbett from the Centre for Energy Policy at University of Strathclyde. Definitely the ambition is great, but we're going to be building a lot of stuff in a condensed time scale, and how does that sort of play out in terms of worker and skill shortages, which the first panel talked a lot about. How does that impact on business and households? How do we make the most of oil and gas supply chains? There's going to be a lot of demand, and understanding where that demand is going to fall in terms of the worker and skills, not just the types of workers and skills we'll need, but whether we can fulfil that demand in terms of the demand that's going to be coming on the construction sector, and how that plays out with all the other infrastructure demands that will be placed, building schools, hospitals, etc. So I think the ambition is great, and certainly my impression, as Paul and Fraser have mentioned, is that there's a lot of coordination between the two governments, but that coordination now needs to extend to local government, needs to extend between NESO, Ofgem, GB Energy, and in terms of thinking about if there's so much coming on board at one time, how do we plan and sequence those projects to make the most and to manage the demand spikes for particular skills and construction. So I think that planning point is really important, and that's not just about spatial planning, that's about planning for how you time and sequence those projects to get them best sort of economic, but also community benefits, which we've been speaking about a lot this morning.
Thank you.
Lillian?
Is investment in clean power in Scotland keeping pace with the decline of the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, I'll have to pick it up. So my area specifically is offshore energy, includes oil and gas, offshore wind, carbon capture, storage, and hydrogen. Let me give you a little bit more building on the previous panel, because I think context is everything, right? So if you look what's happening in the oil and gas sector, it peaked in production in 1999-2000, 4.5 million barrels a day. We are already down 75% kind of at the moment, right? So there is already a quarter of a century of decline. Decline is nothing new. We have been doing it. And the basin is actually very good at declining. The choice we now have for the basin is between managed decline, a managed and orderly decline, or an accelerated and not so orderly decline. That's really the choice we have in front of us. And the reason why this is hugely important is because if you look at the supply chain, up to 80% of the oil and gas supply chain can actually help to accelerate the renewable sector, particularly if you look at carbon capture and storage, or you look at hydrogen. It's 80%, if it's wind, it's about 60% of the supply chain can transfer straight away. The workforce, by our work, over 90% has transferability. So actually, managing the decline in the oil and gas industry allows you to accelerate the renewables agenda, the element we want. This is a hugely important conversation to get it right. It's not about the destination. Destination is clear. We need to get to net zero. It's how do you manage the journey in between? And this is why this is so hugely important. And what we see there is a Goldilocks zone. And the Goldilocks zone is really between now and the early 2030s, where we need to manage oil and gas decline and coincide the job decline, the supply chain decline, to actually go straight to the renewable sector. If we do it right, we have a fantastic opportunity. If we get it wrong, we're losing the supply chain, we lose the workforce, we lose the skills, and we end up importing more. So this Goldilocks zone is absolutely critical, and that's why this is really important. Now, why is it relevant? Is because actually a lot of the workforce is actually based in Scotland. Roughly half of the offshore energy workforce is based in Scotland, and that's a really important element to manage. If you don't get it right, actually see a real huge impact. So therefore it's really critical to get an alignment between these sectors to done really well. And that's, I think, is really important, that we see this as an energy workforce rather than an oil and gas workforce and a wind workforce. In the end, the vast majority of people work for the supply chain. If you work on a vessel, you're completely agnostic if you're going to go to an oil and gas platform, putting a cable down, or you're putting cable down for wind. This is a cable, it's on the vessel. The vast majority work in the supply chain. This is a supply chain management and skills conversation. And we have a choice to get it right. At the moment, we're not there yet.
Can I just add as well, I think just building on Paul's point about making the most of those oil and gas infrastructure and supply chains that really have embedded across the UK over the last half a century. I think there's real opportunities to, building on Paul what said, to take advantage of those and sort of capture UK competitive advantage in areas such as CCUS, where some companies are already reorientating activities. I think also just thinking about the coordination point, I mean, it's not just going to be oil and gas workers where potentially there might be job losses, but it's in other sectors such as retail and wholesale sectors, and how do those kind of job people get retrained? How do skills and training programs factor into that? And some of our researchers also looked at oil and gas capacity, perhaps labour jobs being freed up and looking to move to other sectors, but oil and gas production is still going to be continuing. So there's not necessarily going to be the oil and gas workers freed up capacity in sufficient quantities to service new industries, renewables, CCUS. So I think there's a real role for government in thinking about that coordination point about when skills and workers are available. How do you sort of tailor training programs, not just for those working actually in oil and gas, but in related supply chains who might be at risk of losing their jobs. Okay. And that's, I guess, is also as a just transition piece as well.
Okay, I think the other points have been answered then.
Okay. So it would be you next, Elaine.
Just on the back of some of the stuff that you were saying, I know that there's no any simple solution to the transition for jobs. What skills do you think that the workforce will need coming forward? And how would we encourage employers and investors to take that on? And also, what lessons should both governments learn from Grangemouth?
I'm happy to give it a go, because we spent a lot of time on job skills. Can I start with the jobs, because I think it's really important. by my count, somewhere 67, 68 million people live in the UK, about 33, 34 million work. If you look at how many poor people support the offshore oil and gas industry and the wind industry and carbon capture and hydrogen, roughly 1 in 220 people working in the UK support the offshore energy industry, that is both onshore and offshore. In Scotland, if you do the same calculation, it's roughly 1 in 30. If you're sitting in the northeast of Scotland, where I live, and where Stephen lives, it's 1 in 5, and if you take the induced jobs, it's 1 in 3. So actually, there's a different conversation depending on where you sit in the country, what's happening. Now, if you look at the people currently working in the industry, and again, there's a direct, indirect, and induced jobs, but if you look at the jobs here, roughly half work in Scotland and the other half work in the rest of the UK. But most people currently in the industry actually operating platforms, operating terminals, operating pipelines. But the future of work isn't like that. The future of work is building things. You heard it in the previous panel, you heard it from my colleagues as well, is around building new wind farms, building new substations, building the grid. So we need a different type of workforce, and it's going to be far more kind of location-based, place-based, rather than in one element. So there's a very different type of work coming up with a different skills requirement. And that trick to manage that Goldilocks zone in a really smart way. Because actually, if you're HR, you can move from one industry to the other industry, it's HR. If you finance, it's finance. Procurement, it's procurement. Supply chain is supply chain. Where this gets more challenging is around some of the more bespoke functions, technicians, operations, project managers, people with that kind of more technical background. And that requires very mindful mapping around this. What does the demand in one industry or decline demand in one industry, which the demand in other industries look like? So the role for the New Skills England, the new Skills Development Scotland is really critical to make sure we understand what the demand picture looks like. If you know the demand picture of how many people you need and by when, then you can worry about the second part, is the supply, and then to think about what is the skills we need to meet that demand picture. Now, you heard earlier from Richard in the earlier panel, some really important thing is this also depends how much of the new activity we're going to execute in the UK by UK supply and workforce. If you think about, if you look at the oil and gas industry in the last 50 years, roughly 25-30% of capital activity was executed by UK supply chain and UK workforce. If we do the same for wind and for carbon capture and storage for hydrogen, we're going to import a lot. A lot of the jobs will actually disappear to other countries for us to import the final product. So local content is going to be a huge part of what links into what are the workforce we need, and then really what are the skills we need. Most skills we actually already have. So 90% of the workforce is transferable from currently one sector to the others. Is how we use it, how we develop them. And training is measured in weeks and months, not measured in years. So we actually have all the ingredients for an incredible energy transition. We just need that well integrated planning, coordinated action to make it happen.
Can I add something on industry investment in skills training? I think also what's really important, we did some work with the industrial clusters in Scotland, HyNet, East Coast, which was looking at carbon capture and storage in particular, and the one of the recurring messages was around providing industry and business certainty, and that was about making final investment decisions. And with the example of CCUS, there's been some delay to those. We talked about the Scottish cluster example earlier. So I think that's really critical in terms of providing industry the level of certainty that then they invest in skills and training. Bigger companies investing, and that sort of ripples down the supply chain for them then to make the decisions about upskilling, retraining staff, so investing in skills programs. That's really important, and that's certainly a role for UK and Scottish governments.
Can I add in, sorry, just one final thought, is in terms of capitalising on that opportunity of the transition. One thing, and another proud northeasterner, Forfordland, with friends and family in the oil and gas industry, having done bits of work in the space as well, is that there's still no dedicated nationwide transition fund pipeline process. There's no one obvious place where this happens or service that you can point to. It's still quite complicated. It's still quite up and down and in and out. In a lot of cases, it's still self-funded to a certain point as well. So we could be a lot clearer on the opportunities and on those pipelines. And as Paul says, the role of, in particular, skills development in Scotland has increased over the years and is likely to only become more important. But I think if we want to add just another point onto this, is we're not just talking about oil and gas communities going into offshore wind. We've also got a massive heat transition coming up over the next more likely 20 to 25 years, if we're looking at sort of current timelines for that, which is also an inherently local problem, which also requires inherently local planning and solutions, because the buildings in this part of London are different to the buildings in Forfar to the tenements in Glasgow. So these all require very localised action and planning as well as the transition plans for the North Sea, for Aberdeen, for Grangemouth and others. But how you then ramp up, what new skills do we need, what new people do we need to bring into the workforce longer term? Because while we discuss the 2030 timeline and even the 2045 timeline, this is a much longer perspective that we need to be taking to make sure, again, we learn the lessons of previous transitions and that we are geared up to capitalise on what is a big opportunity in front of us.
Kirstine, I think.
Thank you very much. And my question is for yourself, Fraser. And I do appreciate your background in delivering Glasgow's first ever community energy project. So I'm going to ask you what role you think community ownership of energy assets can play in Scotland's path to net zero, and whether you think both UK and Scottish governments could and should be doing more to support community energy, and also what you think about the role that GB Energy could play in that sphere.
This is my favourite question. So community energy set up the Glasgow Community Energy Project. That was with a load of other incredible people. Community energy is an incredibly powerful thing, often in spite of a very challenging system that's weighted against it in terms of the policy support that's available, in terms of the previously mentioned lack of economies of scale. And also there's a lot of reliance on volunteers in the community energy sector to get projects off the ground. That can be a burden of 1 to 2 years, just to get to the point of having a feasible project that's ready to go. The role that I think community ownership, including shared ownership, where developers have their big projects, a community buys in either to share the revenue of that project or to take a full part ownership stake in that project. I think the role that has to play is threefold. First, there's immense social and economic value that comes from full ownership or shared ownership compared to just community benefit. It does a lot in terms of the majority of community energy organisations also have fuel poverty support arms within the work that they do. Plymouth Energy Community alone reached 11,000 people over the course of the energy crisis to provide support and to link them up with available government support, make sure everyone was claiming the things that they were due. We have other really good examples of places like Staffordshire, where Staffordshire Community Energy have worked with the local NHS trust to put solar panels on the buildings there, which directly funds the local fuel poverty charity, which does outreach to make sure that those most vulnerable and most harmed are supported with a role to play through the transition. So I think this is the second point. The first, they bring a lot of social and economic value. They also create jobs in local areas. The second is engagement. They're often far more trusted as regular community members and organisations than, in a lot of cases, even local councils are at this point. So they have a good role to play within that space, particularly for reaching those groups that are typically excluded, particularly in the clean energy transition conversation. I think the third side of this, if we can be a bit cynical and political about it as well, is that with community ownership, with that value, you naturally build a more broad base of support for that overall clean power mission. Now, that's not to say that we should buy communities off with benefit or with ownership, but when communities have a stake in it, the perspective generally, not just within the community members involved in the project, but more widely in a community, tends to also be more positive, which means you can ultimately get more done more quickly, if that's part of your interest. So I think those three key roles is where we would see them having a role to play. On the final point, GB Energy, very quickly, we have a couple of support schemes here in Scotland, the Welsh Energy Service in Wales, and the Community Energy Fund covering England. I think where GB Energy can layer in, and the local power plan more generally, is one in capacity building, still rely on volunteers, still broadly can't pay staff. The second is in the low-cost finance. So community energy projects tend to get grant money down to do their feasibility. They just about have a project ready, but then traditional finance won't touch them because they're seen as risky organisations, or, again, economies of scale, the projects are seen as too small. So GB Energy, in the interest of maximising public value from the energy transition, for my money, community and shared ownership should be high on their priority list for when they come to spend that local power plant money.
Thank you very much. Can I Hannah and Paul, if they have anything to add to that?
Just perhaps the committee in further explanation around this issue. We're doing some work in Shetland, looking at the impact of green energy development, so Sullom Voe terminal, other things, how they're going to impact on the economy and society there. And we went up back in September now, and there's a really interesting example in North Yell around community ownership of a wind farm. So because obviously you've got the Viking development on Shetland, which has an associated community benefit fund, so you've got the sort of shared ownership model, but then you've got sort of the community benefit. So I think perhaps that might be, and I'm happy to talk to the committee or one of the specialists to point them in the right direction of people that it might be worth talking to. I think as frameworks get developed for how communities benefit from different energy developments, I think there's a real crucial role for UK, Scottish governments, GB Energy to really coordinate around this to ensure that there's some sort of consistency and coherence between these different frameworks, which in the Scottish case are voluntary at the moment, and that creates some sort of level playing field as well, both for communities but also investment and industry players as well.
I'm just going to add a few things what Fraser and Hannah said. I think we need to be collectively very clear what we ask GB Energy to do. And again, because I think it's covering a huge range of activity. I think if we want to set it up for success, I'm sure they'll want to do it as well. It needs a really well, clear, focused, defined agenda with deliverables, what they're going to do, because we ask them to sort out the energy system, we sort about the planning and the consenting. There's lots of things happening. I think we need to be really clear what is the role of GB Energy in the next so many years, where's the focus, so that we have clear expectations and no surprises and no disappointments either.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask the panel, is there an argument that switching from the single national wholesale market for electricity to several local markets would immediately cut electricity bills across Great Britain and most of all in Scotland? For instance, the electricity network balancing costs push bills up, where we pay curtailment costs, as I understand it, we pay local wind farms in Scotland at peak times to effectively stop producing energy. Surely regional or zonal pricing would drive down bills, and the most dramatic reductions in household bills could be in regions that have the most abundant clean power generation, such as Scotland. Surely we could have the cheapest bills in Europe if there was regional pricing.
Just a quick one on that, Douglas. I don't think I've got all the answers for you right now, but we're part of the UK Energy Research Centre, and there's going to be some research looking at that, so we're happy to keep in touch as the sort of findings emerge from that. I don't know if Fraser has...
I'll wade in. So part of the... I think we understand the draw of locational pricing. I think it's important to be clear on what it would mean in practice in terms of the delivery of it. So as it stands, from the extensive sort of REMA consultations, which we still don't have decisions on, as we understand it, the earliest possible implementation of a zonal model of pricing would be 2032. That's current intel. So in terms of immediately reducing bills, there's not an awful lot that it can do in the short term. The challenge that it poses, and while I sympathise particularly as someone interested in Scottish energy and Scottish consumers, while I sympathise entirely with the argument, there's still no real clarity on what potential models of locational, zonal, nodal pricing would be coming forward. I think it did start to narrow down towards the end of the REMA consultation process, but there's no decision being released on that formally yet. That's actually having a bit of an adverse impact in terms of investors and developers are holding back final investment decisions in renewables, which we hope can bring down bills in the shorter term until they know exactly what the outcome is, because they have a current market regime, and then if that potentially goes under fundamental overhaul, that can completely change their business plan for 5, 10, 15 years. So I think what's crucial about this, and while there are arguments both sides of it, it's if you've been across the debate, as I'm sure some members of the committee have, it's been a very confrontational debate in many, many ways. I think the critical thing here is that government takes the decision on REMA, publishes that with as much detail as they can possibly give, because we cannot afford, as we've said already, we cannot afford to stall investment further on the 2030 timeline. 2032 locational, it's almost a sort of an academic discussion at this point. It's post-2030. There are things that should be and need to be implemented in the meantime that will better serve 2030, but also better serve households and people struggling with bills today.
Can I make 2 additional comments? First thing is, I think it would be maybe quite interesting for all of us, and I did it this morning, to look at your utility bill and look what your gas bill is and what your electricity bill is. Because by my bill, currently I pay about 25, 26 pence a kilowatt hour for electricity and about 6 pence a kilowatt hour for gas. Actually, electricity is 4 times more expensive than gas. And if you use gas to generate electricity, you kind of question what's happening. And the reason it happens is because there's quite a lot of charges in our electricity system what's going to go towards the consumer. That is transportation, there's charges, it charges for policy, green charges, all coming to the consumer. And of course, when you think about it, we built the new grid, replumb, rewire, and repurpose the electricity system, and we don't kind of load that back into the consumer, because we end up, what we do now, is that our electricity price is 4 times as high as a gas price per pence per kilowatt hour. And that's a really quite interesting one, because actually that is really not makes any sense. And then the second question is, of course, we have a national system of electricity to move. Other countries have regional elements, which doesn't actually go anywhere, just doesn't connect to the grid. So there's other ways of doing it. And I think as we design the future of our energy system, actually absolutely national systems critical, backbone superbly important, but there are other ways of doing it where we're saying that there might be regional community elements where we do this, where there's a benefit to the community, do it in a very different way. But have a look at your utility bill, because again it is really kind of insightful what actually makes up the cost of what you have, and actually it might actually get under the skin of what the issues really are.
Just add one last note on that as well. I think that's a good point. There are other ways to do it, and there are ways just now that we send locational signals through the energy market. So those network charges are one of them, particularly when it comes to investment. The use of the transmission network is massively high in Scotland because we've got lots of wind up there, lots of people are using the network, so you're trying to shift people to think about plugging in different places. That's also causing delays for developers because it's too high, blows a hole in the side of the business case as they see it. I think there's a point that's been raised a couple of times around curtailment, which is an interesting point, an important point. Emma Pinchbeck picked up that building transmission is the best way to deal with that for curtailment across the board. But headlines have been dominated by paying wind farms to turn down. 76% of curtailment payments go to gas generators, not to wind turbines. So there's a more complex picture at play there. All of it points to the need to build more, get renewables online, but also think about those configurations of the market that ultimately pass value on to consumers at a critical juncture in socio-technical history of this country.
Thank you. Angus.
I'm loving this whole conversation. What happens internationally? So Denmark, 20% of renewables are owned by the community, I understand. And in Helgoland in Germany, they have 3 offshore wind farms, which generates more for the community there than all the community benefits for Scotland as a whole in 2023. Do you think that we can learn from what's happening internationally and make that happen in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is absolutely. I think what we're doing is we're replicating a model we had, which has been very successful for decades, right? And again, I think, but the world of energy is different. It's far more distributed, it's far more place-based, it's far more localized, and it's very different characteristics. Everything is going to connect it because our cars, our house, gadgets, everything is going to be connected to the system. So we need to make sure it works, that there's a backup, that we always have energy security, and we can make sure the whole system is okay. But yeah, there's a very different ways of doing it and have distributed energy in a way where we haven't done before. So there are great models out there, there are great ways of doing it, but I think that we need to require careful planning. We still need the big kind of the motorways to make sure we can move the electrons around the country, but we also need to think about actually not every community needs a motorway and need that kind of solution. So there are different solutions for different problems at different points in time. Island communities can do it very differently, and we've seen very successful examples around the world where that happens.
Anna, did you want to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if it's... I think there's also interesting international comparisons and examples in terms of just transition and also sort of industrial transitions. And the committee might be interested, or might have already been to the Michelin Scotland Innovation Park in Dundee, which is a sort of public-private partnership repurposing the Michelin tire factory, which happened over a number of years. So that sort of planned activity, and now has a skills academy based on it, which is training people to service heat pumps, electric vehicles, etc., but also hosting spaces for start-ups to innovate sustainable products, all sorts of different activities, and was done, as far as I understand, in consultation and close collaboration with the community. So I think there's also examples at a European EU level, but in France and Italy, about looking at kind of understanding skill supply and how that can be matched with the kind of available candidates. And I think we mentioned Denmark before flexi security, so using the social security system in terms of supporting retraining and reskilling. So I think the international the landscape also has some interesting sort of just transition learnings.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questions to you this morning. It was very, very interesting. So thank you very much for coming along, and no doubt we'll be in touch at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much.